The rustle of her skirts against the floorboards sounded like thunder in Grace Valens' ears as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the saloon's back staircase. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the men's voices carried across the smoke-filled room, speaking her name with a familiarity that made her blood run cold. Grace Valens, the tallest one repeated, his voice like gravel as he placed her wanted poster on the bar. 25-year-old woman wanted for theft and murder in Santa Fe, $500 to whoever brings her in. Grace bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from making a sound. $500. It was more than most of these men would see in a year. She hadn't killed anyone. That was a lie fabricated by Arthur Blackton to ensure she'd never escape him. But the truth didn't matter now. All that mattered was staying hidden. The saloon was crowded that evening in 1878, the town of Redemption Creek swollen with cowboys, miners, and drifters passing through the Colorado Territory. The piano player hammered away a jaunty tune while poker games progressed at various tables. No one paid much attention to the shadow of a woman on the stairs, her copper hair tucked beneath a worn hat, her slender frame disguised by the oversized coat she'd stolen off a laundry line. "I heard she's still in the area," another man said, accepting a shot of whiskey from the bartender. "Blackton's offering extra if she's brought to him alive." Grace's fingers clutched the wooden banister. Blackton, the wealthy rancher who'd pursued her relentlessly since she'd refused his advances and then fled after witnessing him murder one of his ranch hands. A crime he'd successfully pinned on her. "What'd she look like?" asked a deep voice that made Grace freeze. She hadn't noticed him before a tall man with broad shoulders leaning against the bar, his back to her. Unlike the others, he wore no gun belt, but something about his posture suggested danger all the same. One of the bounty hunters slid the poster toward him. "Pretty little thing, hair like fire, according to this, green eyes." The tall man studied the poster. "Grace Valens," he said slowly, as if testing the feel of her name on his tongue. Grace edged backward, ready to flee up the stairs. She'd paid for a room at the back of the building with the last of her money, planning to leave at dawn. "Say it again," the tall man said suddenly, turning to scan the room. His eyes, a startling blue that Grace could see even from her hiding place, seemed to pierce through the shadows directly to where she stood. "I dare you." The saloon fell silent, the piano player's fingers halting mid-chord. "What's your problem, cowboy?" demanded one of the bounty hunters. The tall man straightened to his full height, and Grace saw he wasn't wearing the typical clothes of a cowhand. His attire was simple but of good quality: dark trousers, a white shirt with a black vest, and boots that had seen plenty of use but were well made. "My problem," he said, his voice carrying easily through the now quiet room, "is that you boys are speaking about a lady you've never met as if she's already guilty." "There's a poster, ain't there?" the shorter bounty hunter argued. "That's good enough for me. Is it?" The tall man's eyebrows lifted. "I've seen innocent people hang because of a poster. Thought we were better than that in Redemption Creek." Grace watched, stunned, as the stranger deliberately tore the wanted poster in half. "Hey!" The bounty hunter jumped to his feet. "That's my property." The tall man's smile never reached his eyes. "Send me the bill. Now, gentlemen, I suggest you find other entertainment for the evening. Redemption Creek doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." Something in his tone made the bounty hunters exchange glances. Finally, with muttered curses, they gathered their things and headed for the door. As they left, the tall man's eyes swept the room once more, pausing briefly on the shadowed staircase before he turned back to the bar. The piano resumed, conversations restarted, and Grace released the breath she'd been holding. She should go upstairs now, pack her few belongings, and leave through the window. It wasn't safe here anymore, yet curiosity held her in place. Who was this man who had just defended a woman he didn't know, a woman accused of murder? As if sensing her thoughts, the tall man glanced over his shoulder toward her hiding place. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was looking directly at her. With deliberate movements, he paid for his drink and walked toward the stairs. Grace's heart leapt into her throat. She couldn't run now without drawing attention. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping the shadows would conceal her, but knowing they wouldn't. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her with those piercing blue eyes. "Evening," he said quietly. Grace said nothing, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. "No need for that," he said, nodding toward her concealed movement. "I'm not looking for trouble. Name's Henry Calloway, and you're—" "Nobody," Grace whispered, a smile tugged at his lips. "Nobody is it? Strange name." Despite her fear, Grace felt an unexpected urge to smile back. She resisted it. "Those men will be back," Henry said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And they won't be alone. You need to leave town tonight." "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked, suspicion clear in her voice. Henry Calloway studied her for a long moment. "Let's just say I know something about false accusations." He reached into his pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. When she didn't take it, he continued, "Map to my cabin. It's a day's ride north of here in the foothills. Nobody will look for you there." "Why would I trust you?" Grace asked, though she found herself wanting to. "You shouldn't," he replied honestly. "But right now, I'm offering you a better chance than staying here." Before she could respond, the saloon doors burst open again. The bounty hunters had returned, this time with the local sheriff. "There she is!" One of them shouted, pointing toward the stairs. In one fluid motion, Henry grabbed Grace's hand and pulled her up the stairs. "Which room?" he demanded. "End of the hall," she gasped, running alongside him. They reached her room just as boots thundered on the stairs behind them. Henry closed and locked the door, then pushed a heavy dresser in front of it. "Window," he said, crossing to the small opening at the back of the room. Grace grabbed her satchel from under the bed as Henry forced the window open wider. Outside was a narrow ledge and a drop to an alley below. "Ladies first," he said, offering his hand to help her through. "Why are you risking yourself for me?" Grace asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Henry's eyes met hers. "Because nobody else will." He glanced at the door as someone began pounding on it. "Questions later, go." Grace climbed through the window onto the narrow ledge, heart racing as she looked down at the alley below. Henry followed immediately after, pulling the window closed behind him. "There's a stable at the end of the alley," he whispered. "My horse is there. Can you ride?" Grace nodded. Growing up on her father's small farm had given her that skill, at least. They inched along the ledge until they reached a drainage pipe. Henry went first, demonstrating how to use it to climb down. Grace followed, her hands slipping on the metal but managing to make it to the ground without falling. The moment her feet touched earth, Henry took her hand again, leading her quickly through the darkened alley toward the stables. Behind them, shouting erupted from the open window of her room as the pursuers discovered their escape. The stables were dimly lit and smelled of hay and horses. Henry moved confidently to a stall containing a large chestnut gelding with a white blaze on its forehead. "This is Thunder," he said, quickly saddling the horse. "He can carry us both until we can get you your own mount." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, still uncertain about trusting this stranger but having little choice. "First, away from here," Henry replied, tightening the saddle. "Then we'll head to my cabin if we're not followed." He finished preparing the horse and turned to her. "Ready?" Grace hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Ready?" Henry lifted her easily onto the horse, then swung up behind her. The close proximity made Grace tense, but there was no time for discomfort as he guided the horse out of the stable and into the night. They rode hard through the darkness, following back roads and game trails that Henry seemed to know by heart. Grace clung to the saddle horn, her body swaying with the rhythm of the horse. Behind her, Henry's solid presence was both reassuring and unsettling. She'd spent the last year trusting no one, surviving on her wits and determination alone. "Why did you tear up that poster?" she finally asked when they paused to let the horse rest near a stream. Henry dismounted and helped her down. In the moonlight, his face was all angles and shadows. "Blackton is a powerful man," he said, leading Thunder to drink from the stream. "But power doesn't make a man right. You know him." Henry's expression hardened. "I know his type. Men who think money and influence put them above the law." Grace studied him in the darkness. "Are you a lawman?" A smile flashed across his face. "Not anymore." He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they'd rather not discuss. "We should keep moving," Henry said after a few minutes. "They'll have riders out looking for us by now." They mounted again and continued north, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they approached the foothills. By dawn, Grace was exhausted, her body aching from the hours on horseback. She'd begun to doze, leaning back against Henry's chest despite her initial reservations. "Almost there," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. Grace straightened, blinking in the early morning light. They were traveling through a pine forest now, following a narrow trail that wound between the trees. The air was cooler here, fragrant with pine resin and wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she murmured, taking in the scenery. "It is," Henry agreed. "First time I saw these mountains, I knew I'd never leave." They rode in silence for another hour before the trail opened onto a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin, sturdy and well built with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. A corral to one side contained another horse, a dappled gray mare who nickered a greeting as they approached. "Welcome to my home," Henry said, dismounting and helping Grace down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, stiff from the long ride. Henry steadied her with a hand at her elbow, a touch that sent an unexpected warmth through her despite her exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before looking away. "For everything." Henry nodded, leading Thunder toward the corral. "Get inside and rest. We're safe here for now." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and several bookshelves lined with more volumes than Grace had expected to find in a mountain cabin. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom, while a ladder against one wall suggested a loft space above. Grace sank into a chair by the table, her body finally registering the full extent of her fatigue. She hadn't slept properly in days, too afraid of being discovered. Henry entered a few minutes later, carrying her satchel. "You can take the bedroom," he said, setting her bag down. "I'll sleep in the loft." "This is your home," Grace protested. "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will," he replied firmly. "You look dead on your feet, and I've slept in worse places than my own loft." Too tired to argue, Grace nodded. "Just for a few hours, then we need to talk about what happens next," Henry agreed, showing her to the bedroom before leaving her alone. The room was simple, a bed with a handmade quilt, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the mountains. Grace removed her boots and outer clothing, then slipped beneath the quilt. Despite her intention to remain alert, sleep claimed her immediately. She woke to the smell of coffee and something cooking. Disoriented at first, it took her a moment to remember where she was and how she'd gotten there. Sunlight streamed through the window, suggesting it was well past noon. Grace rose, splashed water on her face from the basin on the dresser, and did her best to make herself presentable. Her copper hair, freed from its pins, tumbled down her back in tangled waves. She braided it quickly, wishing for a proper bath, but knowing that was a luxury she couldn't expect. When she emerged from the bedroom, Henry was at the stove, his back to her as he tended to a pan of sizzling bacon. He'd changed into a fresh shirt, and his dark hair was damp as if he'd recently washed. "You cook," Grace observed, announcing her presence. Henry turned, a smile warming his features. "A man living alone either learns to cook or starves. There's coffee if you want some." Grace poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. "How long did I sleep?" "About 10 hours, Henry replied, transferring bacon to a plate. "You needed it." Grace's eyes widened. 10 hours, why didn't you wake me?" "No rush," he said, placing a plate of bacon, beans, and biscuits on the table. "Nobody knows about this place except a few friends I trust with my life." Grace sat at the table, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. She ate gratefully while Henry joined her with his own plate. "Now," he said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a few minutes, "maybe you should tell me what Blackton really wants with you." Grace set down her fork, her appetite suddenly diminished. "Why should I trust you with that?" Henry leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "Fair question. I suppose you have no reason to, except that I tore up a poster with a $500 reward and rode all night to bring you to safety." Grace couldn't argue with that logic. Still, trust didn't come easily after everything she'd been through. "Were you really a lawman?" she asked. Instead of answering his question, Henry nodded. "U.S. Marshal for 7 years, left the service 2 years ago." Why? A shadow crossed his face. "I arrested a man, a wealthy rancher like Blackton, had evidence he'd killed 3 men over a land dispute. But when it came time for trial, witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. Judge threw out the case." His jaw tightened at the memory. "The rancher walked free. 3 months later, he was found dead, shot in the back." "Did you?" Grace began, then stopped herself. "No," Henry said firmly. "Though plenty thought I did, including my superiors. No evidence, but the suspicion was enough to make the job difficult, so I resigned, came up here." He took a sip of his coffee. "Your turn." Grace traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "I worked as a housekeeper for Arthur Blackton at his ranch outside Santa Fe. He took an interest in me that I didn't return." Henry's expression darkened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "One night, I was bringing linens to the main house when I heard shouting. I looked through the study window and saw Blackton arguing with one of his ranch hands, Miguel Santos. Miguel had discovered Blackton was rustling cattle from neighboring ranches and branding them as his own." Grace took a shaky breath. "Blackton shot him, right there in the study. He didn't see me watching. But he found out you knew." Henry guessed. Grace nodded. "The next morning, he came to the servants' quarters, acting strangely. Said he wanted to offer me a better position in his household. Something in his manner frightened me, so I pretended to consider it while planning to leave. That night, I packed my things and fled." "And he framed you for the murder," Henry concluded. "And theft," Grace added bitterly. "He claimed I stole family jewels worth thousands. I've been running ever since." Henry was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face as if searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "I believe you," he said finally. Those 3 simple words nearly undid her. Grace blinked rapidly, fighting back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "The question is," Henry continued, "what do we do about it?" "We," Grace echoed. "You've already risked enough. This isn't your fight." Henry's expression was determined. "I've spent too much of my life watching men like Blackton get away with their crimes. I'm making it my fight." Grace wanted to argue, but found herself strangely comforted by his words. For the first time in a year, she wasn't facing her problems alone. "First things first," Henry said, rising from the table. "We need to get word to a friend of mine. Jim Hawkins, editor of the Redemption Creek Gazette. If anyone can help us build a case against Blackton, it's him." "A newspaper man?" Grace asked skeptically. "Not just any newspaper man," Henry replied. "Jim used to work for the Chicago Tribune before his wife's health brought them west. He has connections across the country and a nose for corruption." He moved to a desk in the corner, pulling out paper and a pencil. "I'll write to him today, and in the meantime," Grace asked. Henry looked up, his expression softening. "In the meantime, you rest and recover. You're safe here." For the next week, Grace settled into an unexpected routine at Henry's cabin. During the days, she helped with chores, cooking, cleaning, tending the small garden behind the cabin. Henry taught her to shoot with his spare revolver, patient as she learned to steady her hand and aim true. "You're a natural," he observed after she hit 3 bottles in a row from 20 paces. Grace lowered the gun, a sense of accomplishment warming her. "My father taught me to shoot a rifle when I was young, but I've never used a revolver before." "Well, you're handling it better than most men I've trained," Henry said, the admiration in his voice making her cheeks warm. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking long into the night. Henry told her stories of his days as a marshal, of the people he'd met and the places he'd seen. Grace shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, before her parents died of fever and left her to make her own way in the world. "How did you end up in Santa Fe?" Henry asked one evening as they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I was working at a hotel in Denver," Grace explained. "Blackton stayed there while on business. He offered me twice what I was making to come work at his ranch." She laughed bitterly. "I thought it was my lucky day." Henry's hand found hers in the gathering twilight, his fingers warm and calloused against her skin. You couldn't have known. Grace didn't pull away from his touch. I should have seen the way he looked at me. The other maids tried to warn me, but I was too focused on the money, she sighed. I was saving to open a small dress shop I can sew quite well. You still could, Henry said. Once this is over. Grace turned to look at him, struck by the quiet confidence in his voice. You really believe we can clear my name? I do, he said simply. His eyes held hers, and for a moment, something electric passed between them. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Henry was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he instructed, moving toward the edge of the porch to get a better view of the approaching rider. Grace stood as well, the gun they'd been practicing with still in her hand. Could it be Blackton's men? Unlikely they'd find this place, Henry said, though his posture remained alert. And even less likely they'd announce themselves with a single rider. As the horse and rider came into view, Henry relaxed. It's Jim, he said, holstering his weapon. The man who rode into the clearing was slight of build, with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray despite his relatively young age. He dismounted with the awkwardness of someone who rode by necessity rather than choice. Henry, he called, securing his horse to the hitching post. Got your message. Henry descended the steps to greet his friend with a handshake that turned into a brief embrace. Appreciate you coming, Jim. Jim Hawkins adjusted his spectacles, his gaze moving past Henry to where Grace stood on the porch. So this is the notorious Grace Valens, he said, his tone making it clear he didn't put much stock in the notorious part. Jim Hawkins, meet Grace, Henry said, gesturing for her to join them. The lady I told you about in my letter. Grace approached cautiously, still uncertain about this new arrival despite Henry's obvious trust in him. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Valens, Jim said, removing his hat. Henry's letter was most intriguing. I've been looking into Arthur Blackton for some time, though never with much success. Let's talk inside, Henry suggested, leading them both into the cabin over coffee. Jim revealed what he'd learned. Blackton's in Colorado territory now, he said. Arrived in Denver 3 days ago with quite an entourage, private security, business associates, even the territorial governor as his personal guest. What's he doing in Colorado? Grace asked, alarmed to hear how close he was. Expanding his empire, Jim replied. He's negotiating to buy the Double R Ranch near Redemption Creek. If the sale goes through, he'll control most of the water access in the valley. Henry frowned. That would give him leverage over every small rancher and farmer in the area. Exactly, Jim confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. I did some digging into the Santos murder. Turns out Miguel Santos had a sister in Santa Fe, Maria. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that her brother discovered something that got him killed, but she doesn't know what. The cattle rustling, Grace said. That's what the argument was about the night I saw Blackton kill him. Jim leaned forward eagerly. If we could get you and Maria Santos together with your testimonies combined. It would be her word and mine against Blackton's, Grace said, the familiar despair creeping back into her voice. A wealthy rancher versus a Mexican woman and a fugitive accused of murder. Not quite, Jim said, reaching into his satchel. He pulled out several folded newspapers. I've been publishing a series of anonymous articles about corruption among territorial cattle barons. Nothing directly accusing Blackton yet, but laying the groundwork. Henry took one of the papers, scanning the article. This is good, Jim. Public opinion might be shifting. And there's more, Jim continued. I've discovered that 3 small ranches bordering Blackton's property in New Mexico mysteriously burned down over the past 2 years. The owners either sold what was left to Blackton at a fraction of its value or disappeared. He's a monster, Grace whispered. A monster with powerful friends, Jim cautioned. Which is why we need to be strategic. I believe I can get Maria Santos to Redemption Creek. If you're willing to come out of hiding and tell your story, Miss Valens, we might have a chance at bringing Blackton to justice. Grace looked to Henry, uncertainty written across her features. What do you think? Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. It's risky, he admitted. Blackton will have men watching for you, but Jim's newspaper gives us something Blackton doesn't expect: a public forum. If the story breaks widely enough, it becomes harder for him to simply make you disappear. There's a town meeting in 3 days, Jim added. Blackton will be there, trying to convince the local ranchers that his purchase of the Double R is in their best interests. It would be the perfect opportunity to confront him publicly. Or the perfect opportunity for him to capture or kill me, Grace pointed out. Not if we're careful, Henry said, his expression resolute. And not if you're not alone. Grace took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could continue hiding, running from town to town, always looking over her shoulder. Or she could make a stand with Henry and Jim beside her. I'll do it, she said finally. I'm tired of running. Relief flooded Henry's features. We'll keep you safe, he promised. I swear it. They spent the remainder of the evening formulating their plan. Jim would return to town and arrange for Maria Santos to travel to Redemption Creek. Meanwhile, Henry would secure a safe place for Grace to stay until the town meeting, somewhere less isolated than his cabin but still out of public view. The widow Cooper's boarding house, Henry suggested. She's trustworthy and her place is on the edge of town, easy to defend if necessary. Jim nodded his approval. I'll let her know to expect you. Both of you, he added, glancing between Henry and Grace with a knowing look that made Grace blush. After Jim retired to the loft for the night, insisting that Grace keep the bedroom, Henry and Grace found themselves alone by the dying fire. Are you certain about this? Henry asked quietly. It's not too late to change your mind. Grace looked into the glowing embers. I'm frightened, she admitted. But I can't live like this forever, and if Blackton isn't stopped, how many more people will suffer? Henry reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. You're the bravest woman I've ever met, Grace Valens. She looked up at him, struck by the tenderness in his expression. I wouldn't be brave enough without you. Something shifted in Henry's eyes. He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of copper hair from her face. Grace, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, her heart hammering. Grace closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly deepened. Henry's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as she wound her fingers into his hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. I've wanted to do that since I first saw you on those stairs, Henry confessed, his forehead resting against hers. Grace smiled, happiness blooming within her despite the danger that still loomed. I've wanted you to since you tore up that poster. Henry chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her. We should get some rest, he said reluctantly. Tomorrow we'll come early. Grace nodded, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. Stay with me tonight, she whispered. Just to sleep, she added quickly, a blush coloring her cheeks. Henry's eyes softened. Are you sure? I don't want to be alone, she admitted. Not tonight. In answer, Henry rose, taking her hand and leading her to the bedroom. They lay down together, fully clothed, Henry's arm draped protectively over her waist as Grace nestled against his chest. For the first time in a year, she felt completely safe. The journey to Redemption Creek the next day was tense but uneventful. They traveled back roads, avoiding the main trails where Blackton's men might be watching. By nightfall, they reached the widow Cooper's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building set back from the main street, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided welcome privacy. Martha Cooper was a sturdy woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Henry with a warm hug and Grace with an assessing look that softened when Henry explained the situation. Any enemy of Arthur Blackton is a friend of mine, the widow declared, leading them inside. That man tried to buy my land last year for half what it's worth. Told him he could have it when I was cold in my grave, and not a day sooner. She showed them to a room at the back of the house, accessible through a separate entrance that wouldn't require Grace to pass through the main areas where other boarders might see her. It's my best room, Martha said, lighting a lamp. Has its own washing area behind that screen, and I've left fresh linens and a nightgown. She cast a knowing glance between Grace and Henry. I'll leave it to you two to sort out sleeping arrangements." Once they were alone, Henry dropped their bags and checked the windows, ensuring they could be securely locked. "We should be safe here until the meeting," he said, though his hand remained close to his gun. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they were planning. "What if we fail?" she asked quietly. "What if Blackton's influence is too strong?" Henry knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then we leave," he said simply, "together. We go somewhere he can't find us." "You would do that?" Grace asked, searching his face. "Leave everything you've built here?" Henry's gaze was steady, certain. "What good is a home without someone to share it with?" His hands tightened around hers. "These past days with you, I've felt more alive than I have in years." Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "I feel the same," she whispered, "but I don't want you to sacrifice everything for me." "It's not a sacrifice if it's what I want," Henry replied, rising to sit beside her on the bed. He cupped her face gently. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Valens. I think I started falling the moment I saw you hiding in those shadows." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted, "against all my better judgment." Henry laughed softly. "Well, no one's ever accused me of being the sensible choice." He leaned in to kiss her, a tender touch that promised more. The next day, Jim Hawkins arrived with news. Maria Santos had reached Redemption Creek safely and was staying with friends outside town. The town meeting was confirmed for the following evening. Blackton's staying at the Grand Hotel, Jim informed them as they gathered in Grace's room. He's been meeting with ranchers individually, trying to secure their support before the public gathering. "And the sheriff?" Henry asked, his expression grim. "Is he still in Blackton's pocket?" Jim sighed. "Sheriff Mills isn't taking sides publicly, but he's been seen drinking with Blackton's men. I wouldn't count on his help." "We need to be prepared for trouble," Henry said, checking his revolver. "Blackton won't take this challenge quietly." "I've arranged for some friends to be present," Jim assured him. "Men who owe me favors. They'll help keep things civil if Blackton's men try anything." Grace listened to their planning, a determined resolve building within her. For too long, she'd been running, afraid. It was time to face her accuser. That night, as they prepared for bed, Henry noticed her quiet demeanor. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently. Grace shook her head. "No, I'm ready for this to end one way or another." She moved to the window, gazing out at the distant lights of the town. "I just realized something today." "What's that?" Henry asked, coming to stand behind her. "For the past year, I've been so focused on surviving that I forgot what it was like to actually live." She turned to face him. "These past days with you, despite the danger, have reminded me." Henry's eyes darkened with emotion. He drew her into his arms, holding her close as if afraid she might disappear. "When this is over," he murmured against her hair, "I want to show you what living really means." "No more running, no more hiding." Grace tilted her face up to his. "Promise?" Instead of answering, Henry kissed her, a kiss filled with longing and promise that left them both breathless. That night, they surrendered to the feelings that had been building between them, finding in each other's arms a passion and tenderness that neither had expected to discover in the midst of such danger. The day of the town meeting dawned clear and crisp. Grace spent the morning with Maria Santos, a slight young woman with determined dark eyes and a quiet strength that immediately earned Grace's respect. Together, they went over their stories, supporting each other through the difficult memories. "My brother was a good man," Maria said softly. "Honest, that was what got him killed." Grace squeezed her hand. "We'll make sure everyone knows that." By evening, the town hall was packed with ranchers, merchants, and citizens curious about the proposed land deal. Blackton sat near the front, surrounded by his men, a commanding figure in an expensive suit, his silver-streaked hair and beard giving him a distinguished appearance that belied his true nature. Henry, Jim, and several of Jim's trusted friends positioned themselves strategically around the room. Grace and Maria waited in a small anteroom, out of sight until the moment was right. The meeting began with the mayor welcoming Blackton and inviting him to speak about his plans for the Double R Ranch. Blackton rose to address the crowd, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the hall as he spoke of progress and prosperity. "My friends," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of inclusion, "the cattle business is changing. Small operations cannot compete with the efficiencies of larger ones. By combining resources, we can ensure that Redemption Creek remains competitive in the growing beef market." There were murmurs of both agreement and dissent from the crowd. One elderly rancher stood up. "Seems to me you're talking about putting us all out of business, Mr. Blackton." Blackton's smile never wavered. "Not at all. I'm offering partnerships, opportunities for everyone to benefit." "Like the partnerships you offered in New Mexico?" Jim Hawkins called out, rising from his seat. Before the mysterious fires forced small ranchers to sell, a hush fell over the room. Blackton's eyes narrowed as he located Jim in the crowd. "I'm not familiar with what you're referring to, Mr. Hawkins." "I think you are," Jim replied, unfolding a copy of his newspaper. "I've been investigating you, Mr. Blackton. Your business practices leave much to be desired. Intimidation, theft, and even murder, all to expand your empire." Blackton's face darkened with anger. "These are serious accusations, sir. I suggest you have evidence before making them, or you'll find yourself facing a lawsuit." "Oh, I have evidence," Jim assured him. He turned toward the anteroom. "In fact, I have witnesses." That was their cue. Henry moved to the anteroom door, opening it for Grace and Maria. As they entered the main hall, a collective gasp went through the crowd. Many recognized Grace from the wanted posters that had circulated through town. "You," Blackton snarled, his composed facade crumbling at the sight of her. "Sheriff, arrest that woman. She's a fugitive wanted for murder." Sheriff Mills stepped forward uncertainly, his hand moving to his gun. Henry immediately positioned himself between Grace and the sheriff, his own weapon visible but not drawn. "Hear them out first, Sheriff," Henry said firmly. "Then decide who should be arrested." The sheriff hesitated, looking between Henry and Blackton. Finally, he nodded. "Say your piece," he told Grace. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she addressed the crowded hall. "My name is Grace Valens. For the past year, I've been running from a false accusation. Arthur Blackton claims I murdered his ranch hand, Miguel Santos, and stole valuable jewelry from his home. Both accusations are lies." She described what she had witnessed that night: Blackton shooting Miguel Santos in cold blood after discovering the ranch hand knew about the cattle rustling operation. Maria then spoke, detailing her brother's character and the notes he had kept about the suspicious cattle movements, notes that disappeared after his death. Jim Hawkins added his findings about the pattern of intimidation, fires, and forced sales that had followed Blackton across New Mexico and now threatened to repeat in Colorado. Throughout their testimonies, Blackton's expression grew increasingly thunderous. When they finished, he surged to his feet. "This is absurd," he roared. "The word of a thieving servant girl and a grieving sister against a respected businessman. Sheriff, do your duty." The sheriff looked troubled, his gaze moving between Blackton and the three who had spoken against him. Before he could respond, an elderly man at the back of the hall stood up. "I was a judge in Santa Fe before retiring here," he announced. "I remember when Miguel Santos was killed. There were irregularities in the investigation that troubled me. Witnesses who seemed coached, evidence that appeared conveniently." He looked directly at Grace. "I always wondered about the girl who supposedly did it, then vanished." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Another man stood, a rancher from outside town. 3 years ago, my neighbor's place burned down. He always claimed it wasn't an accident, but no one would listen. A month later, Blackton's men were running cattle on that land. More voices joined in, people sharing stories of intimidation and suspicious dealings. Blackton's face grew pale with rage as the tide of public opinion visibly turned against him. "Enough," he shouted finally. With a gesture to his men, he started for the door. "I won't stand here and be slandered. Sheriff, if you won't do your duty, I'll take matters into my own hands." As Blackton reached the door, he paused, turning back to fix Grace with a murderous glare. "This isn't over, girl," he hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You'll regret the day you crossed me." The threat hung in the air as Blackton and his men departed, leaving the town hall buzzing with shocked conversations. The sheriff approached Grace, his expression conflicted. "I'm not sure what to believe," he admitted. "But threatening a woman in front of half the town doesn't speak well for a man's innocence." He turned to Henry. "Keep her safe, Calloway. I'll wire the authorities in Santa Fe, see if there's more to this story than we've been told." As the hall emptied, Henry drew Grace aside. "We did it," he said, his eyes bright with pride. "You were magnificent." Grace smiled, though the tension hadn't fully left her body. "It's not over yet. You heard him. He won't give up." "No," Henry agreed, his expression growing serious. "Which is why we need to stay vigilant until the sheriff gets confirmation from Santa Fe. Jim's offered his home. It's on the main street, plenty of people around. I'll join you," Maria added, approaching them. "Together we are stronger, yes," Grace nodded gratefully. With Henry, Jim, and now Maria supporting her, she felt a cautious hope beginning to grow. Perhaps justice was possible after all. They spent the night at Jim's modest house behind the newspaper office, taking turns keeping watch. Henry remained vigilant, checking and rechecking his weapons, clearly expecting trouble. "You think he'll try something tonight?" Grace asked as they sat together in Jim's small parlor, the others having retired to rest. Henry's expression was grim. "Blackton's a man used to getting his way. Being publicly challenged like that, he won't let it stand." Grace moved closer to him on the small sofa. "Whatever comes, I'm glad I'm facing it with you." Henry's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her against him. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I want you to stay. Not just for a while, but permanently." Grace looked up at him, her heart beating faster. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Henry Calloway?" A smile softened his serious expression. "Not very romantically, I'm afraid. I had planned something better than a proposal in the middle of a crisis." "I don't need romantic," Grace whispered, touching his face gently. "I just need you." Henry caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Then yes, Grace Valens, I'm asking you to be my wife. To share my cabin, my life, my future, whatever that may be." Tears of happiness filled Grace's eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." Their moment of joy was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the back of the house, followed by Jim's shout of alarm. Henry was on his feet instantly, gun drawn as he pushed Grace behind him. "Fire!" Jim yelled, rushing into the parlor. "Someone's thrown a torch through the back window." The smell of smoke reached them as flames began to lick up the curtains in the back room. Maria appeared from the guest room, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "Get the women out," Henry ordered Jim. "I'll cover you." Jim ushered Maria and Grace toward the front door while Henry moved cautiously to the windows, scanning the street for Blackton's men. The fire was spreading rapidly, the dry wood of the old building catching quickly. As they reached the front door, a shot rang out, splintering the wood near Jim's head. Outside, shadowy figures moved in the darkness. "Back," Henry commanded, pulling them away from the door. "They're waiting for us out front. The fire's blocking the rear exit," Jim reported, coughing as smoke began to fill the house. Henry assessed their situation rapidly. "Upstairs," he decided. "The roof connects to the building next door. We can cross over." They hurried up the narrow stairs, the smoke growing thicker. Grace helped Maria, who was coughing violently, while Jim gathered what few valuables he could carry, including his notes on Blackton. The upstairs window opened onto a sloped roof. Henry went first, ensuring it was safe before helping the others out. The cool night air was a relief after the smoky interior, but they had little time to appreciate it. Below, they could hear Blackton's men shouting as they realized their quarry was escaping. "This way," Henry directed, leading them across the roof to where to join the neighboring building, a dry goods store. Just as they reached the edge, a bullet whizzed past Grace's ear. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing on the steep slope. Henry grabbed her arm, steadying her as he returned fire. "Go," he urged the others. "Get across." Jim helped Maria make the jump to the neighboring roof, then turned back for Grace. As she prepared to jump, another shot rang out. Grace heard Henry grunt in pain behind her. "Henry." She cried, turning to see him clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "I'm all right," he insisted, though his face was pale in the moonlight. "Keep moving." With Jim's help, Grace made it to the second roof. Henry followed, his movements stiff with pain but determined. They continued across the rooftops until they reached a building with a fire escape at the rear. "Down here," Jim directed, helping them navigate the metal ladder to the alley below. Once on the ground, Grace immediately went to Henry, examining his wound. The bullet had grazed his side, painful, but not life-threatening if treated properly. "We need to get to the sheriff," Jim said, looking anxiously toward the street where a crowd was gathering to fight the fire at his home. "Blackton's men will be watching the sheriff's office," Henry pointed out, grimacing as Grace tore a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. "The church," Maria suggested. "Father Thomas will help us, and it is the last place they would look." It was a good plan. They made their way through back alleys to the small white church at the edge of town. Father Thomas, awakened by their urgent knocking, took one look at their smoke-stained faces and Henry's bloodied side and ushered them in without question. "Blackton's men?" he asked as he helped Grace tend to Henry's wound. Jim nodded. "They tried to burn us out, then shoot us when we escaped. They've gone too far this time," the priest said grimly. "Half the town saw that fire start. Even Sheriff Mills can't ignore such blatant violence." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a knock came at the church door. Father Thomas motioned for them to hide in the vestry before answering. They listened anxiously as the priest spoke with the visitor. "Sheriff," Father Thomas greeted, his voice carrying clearly to them. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Looking for Henry Calloway and Grace Valens," the sheriff replied, "and possibly Jim Hawkins. There's been trouble in town." "I've heard the commotion," the priest said neutrally. "A fire, was it?" "Set deliberately," the sheriff confirmed, "at Hawkins' place." "And there was shooting." "How terrible," Father Thomas said. "Who would do such a thing?" There was a pause before the sheriff spoke again, his voice lower. "I received a reply to my telegram to Santa Fe tonight. Seems there were inconsistencies in the investigation of that ranch hand's murder. The case has been reopened." Grace's heart leapt at the words. Henry squeezed her hand, his eyes bright despite his pain. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, 3 witnesses have come forward saying they saw Blackton's men near Hawkins' place just before the fire started. I've got men looking for Blackton now, but he seems to have left the hotel in a hurry." "I see," Father Thomas said. "And what do you intend to do if you find Calloway and the others?" "Offer protection," the sheriff said firmly. "Whatever Blackton's guilty of, trying to burn people alive in their beds isn't something I'll tolerate in my town." After a moment's consideration, Father Thomas opened the vestry door. "They're here, Sheriff, and one of them needs a doctor." The sheriff's eyebrows rose at the sight of Henry's bandaged side, but he nodded respectfully to the group. "Miss Valens, I owe you an apology," he said directly to Grace. "I should have listened sooner instead of taking Blackton at his word." "You're listening now," Grace replied. "That's what matters." The sheriff detailed his plan to move them to the safety of the jail, ironically the most secure building in town, while a posse searched for Blackton and his men. A doctor would be summoned to tend to Henry properly. "What about my newspaper?" Jim asked, distress evident in his voice. "My home," the sheriff's expression was sympathetic. "The building's gone, Jim, but the press in the cellar might be salvageable. We'll know more by morning." They were escorted to the jail under heavy guard, aware that Blackton could still have men watching. The doctor arrived promptly, confirming that Henry's wound wasn't serious but needed proper cleaning and stitching to prevent infection. As dawn approached, with Henry resting on a cot in one of the cells, Grace finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She sat beside him, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep. "You should rest too," he murmured, his eyes opening to find her watching him. Grace shook her head. "I can't, not until they find him." Henry's fingers tightened around hers. "They will. Blackton's run out of places to hide." The sheriff burst into the jail just as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the barred windows. His expression was a mixture of excitement and grim satisfaction. "We found Blackton," he announced, "trying to board the eastbound train. Grace rose to her feet, hope and apprehension warring within her. "Did you arrest him?" The sheriff's expression turned solemn. "No need. When he saw us coming, he tried to shoot his way out, took a bullet to the chest." He paused. "He's dead, Miss Valens. It's over." The words hit Grace like a physical force. She sank back onto the bench beside Henry's cot, tears of relief streaming down her face. "His men?" Henry asked, pushing himself up despite his injury. "Most are in custody," the sheriff assured them. "The rest scattered. I've wired the authorities in Santa Fe with the full story. They'll be sending someone to take formal statements, but they've already indicated that all charges against Miss Valens will be dropped." Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. After a year of running, of looking over her shoulder, of living in fear, it was over. She was free. Henry's arm encircled her waist, drawing her close against his side. "Told you we'd clear your name," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. The sheriff cleared his throat, a faint smile playing at his lips as he observed their obvious affection. "I'll leave you folks to rest. You're welcome to stay here until we're certain all the danger has passed." After he departed, Jim approached, Maria at his side. "Well," he said, his characteristic energy somewhat diminished by the night's events, "I may have lost my newspaper, but I've gained the story of a lifetime." "You've gained more than that," Maria said quietly. "You helped bring justice for my brother." Jim's expression softened as he looked at her. It was the right thing to do. Grace noticed something in the way they looked at each other, a connection forming amid the chaos. Despite everything, she couldn't help but smile. "What will you do now?" she asked Jim. He straightened his shoulders. "Rebuild. The press may be salvageable, and even if it isn't, the stories still need telling." He glanced at Maria. "And I may have found a new assistant editor with a keen eye for the truth." Maria blushed but didn't contradict him. In the days that followed, the full extent of Blackton's crimes came to light. Investigators from Santa Fe arrived, taking statements from Grace, Maria, and others who had suffered at Blackton's hands. The evidence was overwhelming, including account books found among Blackton's possessions that detailed the cattle rustling operation. Grace's name was officially cleared, a fact announced publicly in both the territorial newspaper and in a special edition of the Redemption Creek Gazette, printed on a press loaned by a neighboring town until Jim could replace his own. Henry recovered quickly, though Grace insisted he rest longer than the doctor recommended. They stayed at the widow Cooper's boarding house, making plans for their future while the last loose ends were tied up. "I was thinking," Henry said one evening as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset. "The cabin's a bit small for a family." Grace looked at him, a smile playing at her lips. "Are you already planning on children, Mr. Calloway?" Henry's eyes crinkled with warmth. "At least 2 or 3 if you're agreeable, Mrs. Soon-to-be Calloway." The title sent a thrill through her. "I'm very agreeable," she assured him, "but I love your cabin. It's perfect just as it is." "For now," Henry conceded, "but I thought we might add a room or 2 over time. And perhaps build a proper workshop for you." Grace tilted her head. "Workshop? For your dressmaking," Henry explained. "You said you wanted to open a shop. There's no reason you can't do that in Redemption Creek." Emotion welled up in Grace's chest. Through everything, he had remembered her dream. "You wouldn't mind having a wife who works," Henry laughed softly. "Grace, after watching you face down a murderer and survive being hunted for a year, I'd never presume to tell you what you can or cannot do." His expression grew serious. "I want you to be happy, whatever that takes." Grace leaned into him, overwhelmed with love for this man who saw her strength as something to admire rather than control. "I already am happy," she whispered. "Happier than I ever thought possible." 1 month later, on a perfect autumn day, Grace Valens became Grace Calloway in a simple ceremony at the rebuilt church in Redemption Creek. Jim Hawkins stood as Henry's best man, while Maria Santos, now working full-time at the Gazette and clearly becoming more than just Jim's assistant, served as Grace's maid of honor. The entire town turned out for the celebration, many bringing gifts and well wishes for the couple who had helped expose Blackton's corruption and protected the valley from his influence. Even the sheriff attended, presenting them with a deed. "What's this?" Henry asked, examining the document. Blackton's men burned down Jim's place, the sheriff explained. Seems only fair that the property Blackton was trying to buy gets redistributed to those he wronged. The territorial governor agreed. He nodded toward the deed. There's a parcel there for you and Miss Valens, Mrs. Calloway now. Good grazing land with a creek running through it. Henry was speechless, while Grace could only express their thanks through tears of gratitude. That night, as they traveled back to Henry's cabin, their cabin now, Grace found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her here. From a frightened woman hiding in the shadows to a bride returning home with the man she loved. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked as they approached the familiar clearing. The cabin looked welcoming in the moonlight, smoke curling from the chimney where Jim had started a fire for their return. "About that night in the saloon," Grace replied, "when those men were speaking my name and I was hiding on the stairs." Henry smiled at the memory. "And I said, 'Say it again, I dare you.'" "You never told me why you did that," Grace said, looking up at him curiously. "You didn't know me. I could have been guilty of everything they claimed." Henry reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. In the silvery moonlight, his blue eyes were full of certainty. "I saw your face in the shadows. There was fear there, yes, but not guilt." He reached across to take her hand. "And maybe, just maybe, I was already falling in love with the woman brave enough to stand alone against such powerful enemies." Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "I wasn't alone for long," she said softly. Henry leaned across the space between their horses, kissing her tenderly. "And you never will be again," he promised. They continued toward the cabin, their future stretched out before them like the vast Colorado sky, full of possibility, promise, and the certainty that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. In the years that followed, Grace and Henry built the life they had dreamed of during those dangerous days. The cabin expanded room by room as their family grew, first with the arrival of their daughter Emma, born exactly 1 year after their wedding, and then their son Michael 2 years later. Grace opened her dress shop in town, quickly developing a reputation for quality work that drew customers from as far as Denver. Henry raised cattle on their land while continuing to help Jim Hawkins investigate corruption in the territory. The Redemption Creek Gazette became known for its fearless reporting, especially after Jim and Maria married and combined their talents officially. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the mountain air was crisp with pine and possibility, Henry and Grace would often sit on their expanded porch, looking out over the land they had come to love so deeply. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Grace would sometimes ask, her head resting against her husband's shoulder, and Henry would always answer the same way, pulling her closer and pressing a kiss to her copper hair, now streaked with the first threads of silver. "No," he would say simply. "Because from the moment I saw you hiding in those shadows, there was only one way our story could end." Grace would smile, knowing he was right. For a woman who had once hidden in darkness, afraid to speak her own name, there was no greater blessing than this life built in the light, a life of love, purpose, and the enduring courage they had found in each other.